Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me and for everyone who's attending today. My name is Paul Taylor. I'm currently the Executive Director of Food Share Toronto. I'm the outgoing Executive Director of Food Share Toronto, and I'm also a consultant with evenings and weekends consulting, and I do some teaching at Simon Fraser University. I teach a couple leadership courses and a course on fundraising. So in relation to today's topic, as we explore food insecurity, something that I think a lot about, not only that I think a lot about, but something that I've also had personal experience with, having had grown up in a food insecure household and one that was also navigating poverty. And I think so often these conversations are anchored around individuals, around households, around the community organizations that try to support them, be it food banks or other food-based charities like Food Share. But I think these conversations often, we really need to begin them somewhere else. And we need to begin them with the realization that in Canada, we all have a right to food. We've had a right to food since 1976, since the government ratified the right to food. It was first introduced in 1966. So that sets out a whole bunch of obligations and duties for our governments to ensure that we can all access food. Also acknowledging that there are also Indigenous folks on this land for whom there is an inherent right to food that also needs to be respected, may not have been decided in a parliament, but also is vital and is being ignored. So I'd love to start those kinds of conversations here. So maybe I'll end there for a few opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing that. And we appreciate you also sharing your background personally and professionally related to the field. Rachelle, you're up next.
Here we go. Wache, hello. It's nice to be here and see everyone involved. Thank you for the invite. My name is Rachelle Metatawabin. I'm currently speaking from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa. A bit about me. I hold a few titles, but primarily I work as a child welfare advocate. As Benita had mentioned, I sit as a council member with lived experience on the Poverty Reduction Advisory Council. Sounds very redundant. My apologies. And then I also piloted a mentorship program within for youth aging out of the child welfare system in Ottawa, which we primarily focused on navigating the systems, breaking down silos, and collaborating with different organizations to ensure that while you're aging out without family, you have the right to access all the supports that you need in order to thrive. For our topic today, a lot of my passion and experience comes from my upbringing as an Indigenous woman who grew up up north along the Hudson Bay coast. I'll want to bring up the Canada Food Guide and where that originated, how that affected my family specifically, and the communities up north. Also, the thing about food insecurity and the right to food is that there are so many organizations and systems and people working together that food is going to be in so many topics that I don't really know how to break it down to 4. So throughout the questions, I'll probably bring up random pieces of different policies and different experiences that really intersect and kind of just give different insights, I suppose, to the right to food. My gosh.
Thank you so much, Rachelle, for sharing that. That is a really important point you bring up about northern food options not being so much available here, just in general, especially with climate change and just accessibility options. So I appreciate that, Rachelle. And next we are going to have Ben.
Hi, thank you. I'm honored to be on this panel with Rachelle and Paul. I am calling from the traditional land of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island under the Williams Treaty, which is known as Oshawa, Ontario, where Feed the Need in Durham is based. I am currently the CEO of Feed the Need in Durham, have been with the organization for the last 7 years, but I've done extensive work in my community since graduating university in the areas of community development and community building. And all of that work prior to my time at Feed the Need always revolved and tended to always come back to food and food security and how we can use food as a way to build communities, not just to address the basic needs, but build communities as well, and build reduce barriers between communities, especially when I was doing work in immigration and settlement. It was a great way to build and connect communities across cultures and divides. In the other work that I do, I am also work very closely with Basic Income Canada Network and have helped build and organize another organization on basic income called UBI Works. And I have extensive work with both those organizations in looking at how we may implement a national basic income in Canada as a way of improving income security supports for everyone who resides in this country. Things that I want to talk about, I agree with Paul's comments, and I'm very much an advocate for food as a right. But one of the things I've been exploring within our organization is how we can take this argument a little bit further to talk about food as a common good. Beyond it just being a right, but being something that we collectively create and have access to. And this is going back to the history of people, of all people. Food started as a collective good. And it was only over time in history that it became a commodity that we now trade and sell. And over that course of that transition, we've created increasing forms of food insecurity, especially for the most marginalized among us. And one of the things that we're really exploring at my organization and in our community is how we can reframe that conversation and rethink our role as a food security organization in Durham region, in how we can better serve our community by thinking differently about the work we do. So today's conversation, I'd love to sort of raise those issues and engage on those types of topics.
Thank you so much, Ben. I appreciate you sharing that. We are going to dive right into some of our questions that we've developed. So why don't we start off this time with Rachelle? The first question for us today is, what are the barriers that interfere with or prevent food security? So for example, income, employment, equity, geographic location, like you mentioned, racism, access to appropriate food, or anything else that you may want to discuss.
Barriers. As I mentioned, there's quite a few hats to myself, and I think about all the barriers that other individuals experience as well. So for myself, I'm a single parent. I have a daughter who's 4, just started school this year. I am a Cree woman who grew up basically all over Ontario in different foster families with my biological family, living in couch surfing with different families. Specifically in Ottawa, I was very grateful to meet different individuals who opened up their homes and families to myself. I think about how it affects child welfare when you have so many children going from different homes with different dietary needs, different experiences, different cultural needs, and you have all these titles and you think about all the barriers that you have to get through when you need to access food. So for instance, I think about when I grew up, we didn't really get to have choices of what to eat when we were living up north. Like, grocery stores are far and few, and then the prices on their own are exponentially high. So even trying to access fresh produce is very difficult. Reserves across the land are put in geographical locations that are hard to even grow any types of food. And so that makes it a barrier as well. If you don't have access to water or electricity, hydroponic towers or solar panels become something you have to consistently think about. And then you think about my personal family and our communities who grew up in residential schools and the history of where the food guide came from. I think Ian Mosby wrote an article or a research paper called Administering Colonial Science, and he describes a lot of how the food guide system came to be and experiments, they were experiments that happened to children within residential schools. And, you know, what was the bare minimum that you could sustain on, and what could you not have in your life in order to get through the day? And that intergenerational trauma lives inside your body, inside your system. And my grandparents grew up in St. Anne's residential school, and you know, our family felt it significantly in what we ate and what we didn't eat, what we had, you know, an abundance of starches and sugar foods. And it really, when you think about it, doesn't do well on your body as well as mentally. You know, that leads into when you go to school, when you go to work, how do you think and flourish in these systems without food that is good for your body? And, you know, food that doesn't make you lethargic. And as you get older, you think about this consistently. So I will stop there for sure.
No, that's very helpful, Rachelle. Thank you. And that's really horrible that they were testing this out on children that were at the residential schools. I didn't know that. Surviving on the bare minimum, that's awful. And like you mentioned, the point of geographic location and some of the background on the food security guide or the food guide may be helpful for us to know, just in terms of what is accessible and what is not and what they recommend. So thank you. I'm going to move on to Paul next, and just a reminder to try and keep responses to around a minute or two. Thank you.
Yeah, I will try my best. When we think about the impediments, you know, that get in the way of you know, that cause food insecurity, you know, I think it's really important to think about, and I'm going to come back to the right to food, but think about capitalism in the way that this tension exists where we have a right to food in this country, but yet, as was mentioned, you know, food has been made a commodity. So we, in essence, don't have a right to food. It's in name only. So people can only access food based on whether or not they can afford it. And that's not a major part of the conversation around the way this country wrestles with the right to food. I also think things like racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism. You know, it's important to acknowledge that people are not vulnerable. Being Black doesn't mean that I am vulnerable to food insecurity, actually. And I think that's a really important assertion. Being Indigenous doesn't mean that someone is vulnerable to food insecurity. What we're vulnerable to is anti-Indigeneity and anti-Black racism and systems, public policies and institutions that cause us to be more vulnerable to things like food insecurity. So as we think about these issues and we think about how to respond, we absolutely cannot be advancing solutions that don't center the reality of the history of colonization and anti-Black racism on this land and racism and how it's manifested itself.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate you sharing that. And it is important to recognize that approach. I think it's more dignified in that racialized people, Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, it's not themselves that are necessarily vulnerable. It's the systems and the anti-Indigenous, anti-Black aspects as well. So thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to move on to Ben next, if you'd like to share with us some of the barriers that can interfere with food security.
Yeah, I want to first say I completely agree with Paul's take on the commodification of food. And the way I look at it is, in our community, we're an agricultural community in Durham region. Some of the biggest agricultural community in the GTA is in Durham region. Yet right down a couple miles away in places like the south end of Oshawa, there are racialized and other communities who do not have access to the food we grow in our own community. And that is a very localized example of the way we've commodified food. We've also, the other example is a lot of that food is produced by racialized and immigrant communities, right? We wrestle with this in our community, and to the point where organizations like mine are asked to address the food security of farm workers, which I think is just a pure example of some of the things, actually, Paul, you just mentioned around the commodification of food. The individuals we bring to this country to pick our food and harvest it for us and produce it for us are themselves food insecure in many ways, which is an incredible example of what we've done to a food system. And the last comment I want to make, and in response to some of the racialization and the anti-indigeneity that in the food system, is individuals like myself, and I very much mean white, male, straight, university-educated men, need to realize what we've done to marginalize. And because I don't like the word vulnerability either. We have marginalized these communities through the actions of systems that we've created in our benefit. And it's a really difficult conversation for us to try and have, but it's a necessary one because we have deliberately marginalized communities in many ways through the systems we've created. And I prefer the word marginalized, not attributing that to these communities, but as an action, as a verb that we have done to create a lack of access to, especially in the food system. So I'm trying to, I would like to sort of start reframing that word and using it as an action word for what individuals have and what we've done systematically to create these barriers.
Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing that. And it is a good point to pay attention to language and use language that is appropriate and respectful. And also the point you brought up about who is growing food, who is bringing the food to the table, and what populations are involved in that as well is important to pay attention to. So I'm going to move on to our second question. And this one is a bit of a three-part question. So I'll just read the whole thing out first and feel free to respond to whatever aspects may apply to you. And again, just trying to stay within the 1 to 2 minute time frame. So this is, how does the right to food in Canada relate to barriers to food security? And why are some populations disproportionately affected by food insecurity? We kind of brought this up a little bit before. And as well as the historical underpinnings of the increased likelihood of some populations to be food insecure. So just taking what happened in the past and kind of seeing how it may have impacted specific populations in the present. For this question, why don't we start out with Ben?
So I think that, like I said, my perspective around the right to food grows when I start to think about food as a collective and common resource. And I think by going through this transition historically of taking away that right, whether in our country through colonial action, taking it away from First Nations and others, taking it away from groups that immigrate to our country as well, based on marginalizing them. I think by taking away this common access to food and really commodifying our food, we've removed that right. We've taken it away. And we've created, well, I agree with the sentiment that food insecurity is not a food problem in many ways, it is an income problem. And speaking as a basic income advocate, I also feel like something like income security is not the right full answer either. It is also a temporary answer because it really only allows us to create improved food access within a system that is already poorly structured and is marginalizing people and eliminating them. It may, from access to the food, it may create improved temporary access, but it is not necessarily the long-term solution. And I think we really need to rethink how we think of our food system and think about it as it's not just a right, it is a common good that we need collectively in order to survive.
For sure, yes, it is important to have food to survive. So thank you for mentioning that. It's not just something produced or a commodity like many other things. Why don't we go on to Rachelle next?
Sorry. When I think of barriers, I think of policies and exactly what Ben and Paul have said. You know, more specifically, I think about back in 2020 on the East Coast with the Mi'kmaq people and fisheries, lobster hunting, how that relates to transportation, shipping that affected racism. Well, it didn't affect racism. We saw racism at an extreme high over there. And so I guess it consistently makes me wonder about how certain communities look at certain individuals, specifically Indigenous people, and how their right to land and food affects a simple family, right? And it took a lot of effort and fighting for those communities on the East Coast to get their right to fishing and lobster hunting. And I think about how that's going to affect many other communities across the land, you know, with BC pipelines, with the water accessibility within northern communities. And then when those finally happen, how will racism and systemic policies continue to affect those people and food insecurity when it's a right that is meant to be had, that the federal government is supposed to continue to ensure, specifically with the TRCs.
Thank you so much, Rachelle, for outlining that right. And it is like the right not just to access things within a grocery store or within a food bank, but to be able to actually access food according to traditional ways like fishing, and the legal implications that have with legislation that are preventing people from doing that, especially Indigenous people. So thank you for mentioning that. Paul, why don't we go on to you next?
Okay, so I've been thinking about, the part of the question that asked about, the increased likelihood of food insecurity for certain communities. And I think there's an element of that. Sure, we talked about, the foundations of that, which are anti-Black racism, colonialism, capitalism, but I think it continues to show up. So one of the things we're seeing, we are seeing a lot of organizations point to those oppressive organizing principles, but not pointing to themselves as well. Because I think this problem continues because there are resources made available to both understand, respond to, and address the issue of food insecurity. But when we think about who's tasked with the solution finding, and when I say tasked with the solution finding, I mean, who's resourced and well-resourced to find the solutions? Well, let's look at who our policymakers are. Our policymakers are disproportionately white men. Cisgendered, able-bodied white men are the heads of the organizations tasked with responding to food insecurity and poverty, who are leading the design of interventions are often white men as well, or white folks. The larger the budget, the more likely it is to be a cis white man. These are the sorts of problems that we are not contending with in our sector in terms of, we are replicating systems that largely exclude people that are most affected by the issues that we're working on from being resourced to respond to them. So I think it's really important that we start to look at our own organizations, look at the makeup of our organizations, recognizing that it's often Black and brown folks who exist at the bottom of the pay grid and white folks at the top of the pay grid and in management. And until we can contend with that kind of issue that is pervasive in this sector, we are going to continue to advance white universalism and white folks advancing interventions that might work well for white folks, but don't get to the crux of the issue for many of us.
Thank you, Paul, so much for mentioning that and also examining the aspect of not just the barriers for people who are unable to access food, but also that there are systemic barriers, especially within leadership and decision-making, and that there is a fault of not enough diverse representation of Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks at the top, and how that impacts things as they trickle down. And that actually ties into the next question, one that I find particularly interesting, which is how do power inequities, for example, individual, social, or corporate, create the barriers to food security, and what can be done to address this power imbalance? So Paul, since you were kind of tying into that, do you want to start us off for this one?
Sure. I heard individuals, corporations, and what was the other one?
Social. So at the power inequities at the level of the individual, social. So I guess like within the community, and corporate. Okay.
I think individuals hold this issue in place because we don't understand it. We think food insecurity is about food. So we respond with, responding to that moral imperative to feed our hungry neighbor by looking in our cupboards and identifying what we can donate. But I think politicians and some food-based charities and corporations have participated in creating food charity as our default response to these public policy issues. So I think individuals and the way that we organize organizations help hold these issues in place. Corporations, we're seeing an increasing number of people that are food insecure that are actually working full time. So I think it's another way that not just corporations are letting people down, but our governments are letting people down and allowing for legislation that actually impedes our right to food. I work at an organization that's a living wage employer in the city of Toronto, which, it means none of my colleagues make less than $24 an hour. Living wage is $22.08 in Toronto. But these are the types of things that are really important. $15.50, which is the living wage in Ontario, is not the living wage in any region in Ontario. So when our governments, provincial governments, allow minimum wage to be pegged at rates that are unlivable, they are actively not just impeding our right to food, but in essence ensuring that people do not have food to eat and that people are going to continue to struggle who have already been made to struggle.
Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing that and looking at kind of how the system is set up, and that a lot of the decision making on whether folks get to access food lies with those governing or corporate bodies that decide people's wages and a lot of other things within the system. And then unfortunately, right now, the power doesn't lie with people at the middle and lower income levels to be able to make decisions for themselves on whether they can access fair income or food. So why don't we move on next to Ben?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to respond sort of thinking about within the corporations within the food security and food charitable sector, and sort of a bit to Paul's point earlier about the leadership of those organizations, because I represent that leadership. And what we need to be doing is we need to be seeding that leadership in ways that are sustainable. It doesn't mean just simply making sure that it doesn't mean walking away right away. It doesn't mean that. It means but building sustainability and allowing individuals that don't look like us, that don't come from our backgrounds, to rise in our organizations and then seed our positions. We don't need, and I recognize this within Feed the Need, and we're looking at ways that we can, through succession planning, that we are building a diverse staff and building diverse volunteers and building a diverse board that represents the communities that we actually serve, so that the leadership is not always going to be the same. And that's but it's a difficult conversation for my colleagues and myself. We have to recognize, but the biggest thing for us is we have to recognize that seeding our opportunities and power in many ways does not mean we're not losing anything. We're actually gaining, because we're creating a better community for everyone. We're creating a better community for our children. And I have kids, and the world I want them to grow up in is one that is more diverse, that does have better leadership, and that they can learn from others in a way that maybe I wasn't afforded the opportunity to, and be mentored by others that maybe I wasn't able to be mentored by. So we have to look at ways that individuals like myself can seed our roles in order to address the power imbalances within our own organizations. We can't just continuously point to outside of our organizations. We need to look within, to Paul's point, and I completely agree with it. It's an uncomfortable one for us, but that's okay. We've never been placed in cis white men have never been asked to be uncomfortable, and I think it's about time we are asked to be uncomfortable. And I think that's a fair thing to be asked of us. And I think that's where some of this needs to be starting. So.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for acknowledging that, and also bringing up the structure of the system where often in leadership, there is not a lot of diversity, or it's hard for a lot of folks to get in who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, or racialized, or the structure isn't really set up in a way that is friendly for people to step in, and that it's on both internally, not just externally, to bring folks in and give them that seat at the table, and also for folks that already are within your organization and amplifying voices. So thank you, Ben. And Rachelle, you are up next.
Thank you. Great points. I guess to add on to what Paul and Ben have said, I think about funding structures, the increase in food banking, and how there's less focus on independence and dignity for people, the right to choose what you eat. As mentioned before, many people have different allergies and dietary restrictions. Many people are focusing on what food does to you that makes you feel good mentally, physically, socially, environmentally. You know, I think about how there needs to be less reliance on nonprofits, grassroots, and solutionaries, as what's already been mentioned, more focus on a thriving wage. You know, there's so many people that are doing such great work out there, but it's not on these organizations to provide healthy food or good food or food in general to people. It's not their responsibility, because as we've mentioned, we created the society that works on funding and works on providing siloed structures, so that way there's somewhere to place blame, when realistically we need to, you know, now is the time to place accountability on certain corporations and structures. More specifically, I think about transportation, you know, transportation costs, shipping costs, you know, grocery stores, inflation rates. You know, these are all things that larger corporations can do and should put more investment to, should speak on to. And I think that's where we're at a point in right now.
Thank you so much, Rachelle. And I think that really does speak to power inequities, because oftentimes it is those in power, the government's decision on where do people access food, and it always falls on those food banks or on nonprofits, but kind of reworking that balance within the system is important to do, and also a lot more sustainable. So thank you for mentioning that. So for our next question, I think I'm going to start this one off with Ben, because you were kind of speaking a bit about what leaders can do and kind of the responsibility and onus on yourself and others in organizations. This question is, what concrete and realistic steps can leaders and organizations take to tackle these barriers and work towards or create a more equitable environment? So this is a solutions-based question.
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, we need to, I've already said it, I won't reiterate, but look internally and see what we can do to ensure that the communities we serve and that are truly marginalized in our community around food are represented in many ways, whether that's with our volunteers all the way through to the leadership roles. So we need to really look internally and make decisions about how we're going to build an organization that allows for the growth of diversity, inclusion, and true engagement of those that we serve. So that's the first thing we have to really do. And then we have to make sure that we are really working with communities on terms that make sense to them and that actually are driven by them. An organization like a food charity organization like mine cannot impose solutions. We need to be open to community solutions and find ways that we can use our resources, our structures, and frankly, our power to support those community actions rather than driving them ourselves. So we're trying at our organization to create ourselves as a resource available to the community versus that can be mutable and create solutions with community versus coming to them and saying, hey, here's how we can address and create equity and create opportunity. So it really just means, to me, it means we have to be leaders who are open to what our communities are telling us and realize that in my role at Feed the Need, I'm a steward of the resources that the community have built. It's not my resource. And my job when I leave here is to have stewarded it in the way that leaves it as a better resource than when I got it. And that means being better available to diverse and other communities that are actually the ones who are struggling in our community.
Thank you so much, Ben. And it is important to remember that it's not just those organizations that have a lot more power according to the system that can impact change. It's often more individuals, communities, and I guess grassroots organizations that have that knowledge about what their community's needs are, and often that funding or that power and decision making needs to be reallocated towards them. So thank you. I'm going to go on to Paul next, and we do have one more question after this and about 5 or 10 minutes left in the session, so just bearing in mind with time. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, in terms of one thing that we can do, maybe I'll say two things that leaders can do. And again, I think we've got to start inside our own organizations because there is urgency there as well. So I've talked a lot about racial injustices that exist in the food system. I've talked about, and others have, and I think racial injustices also exist within our organizations. So I think economic justice is also racial justice. So one of the first things that we can do is, as leaders, we can prioritize, if we haven't already, paying livable wages to all of the people that we work with. There's something else that doesn't get talked about enough, and I think it's, especially, for obvious reasons, I'll leave that piece, but something that doesn't get talked about enough is the benefits. The fact that people have to wait for 3 months before their benefits to kick in when they start working somewhere. We recognize that if you're Black or brown, the vulnerabilities that you've been exposed to have led to health inequities. So what we're saying is, here is another barrier that doesn't take into account societal inequities. So at FoodShare, we start benefits at day one. I think that's something that more organizations should be doing. People take life-saving medicine, but to have to wait 3 months to access this is ludicrous. So I think those are two things: livable wages, benefits starting at day one.
Thank you so much, Paul. Those are both great points. And that 3-month wait period is something I found out about recently too, and was very frustrated about. So thank you for highlighting it. Rachelle, you are up next.
Thank you. When I think about what organizations can do, I feel like a lot are already doing this, and maybe just more encouragement of breaking down silos and working in collaboration with other organizations. I think of the work within Ottawa specifically, and how there are groups that are partnering with mental health workers, health centers to write healthy prescriptions. So if you live out of bounds, you can go to a food bank. And I believe these organizations do the same, partnering with communities that are racialized, that do more predominantly have less than, there. And I think somebody in the chat mentioned delivery options. That's something else that organizations have looked into and partnered with social enterprises that have access to vehicles to help those with mobility issues. And then more simple and basic for any individual to do realistically. And I know the work is hard. I know it's tiring. I know funding is always such a burden on so many people, but kindness, compassion, and conversation go such a long way when how you can, a realistic step in just helping somebody who is going and finding these resources to access, because it takes a lot. You're breaking down your ego, and you're putting yourself in a less dignified situation, and you're essentially begging for food to get you through the day, to get you to work, to get you to school, to get you to raise your children or care for your parents, etc. It's just just chatting. How is your day? Do you need some water or coffee? Would you like some food right now? What can I bring you to take home? It's just, those things change your mood and that individual's mood so much that it just, I always grew up with a smile goes a long way. And my grandfather would always, when we went to, I know this isn't the right corporation to say, but the McDonald's, when they would say a free smile, or we'd guarantee a free smile, we'd always leave. He's like, so am I getting my free smile? And so anytime, I always think about that when speaking with people.
Thank you so much, Rachelle. And I think that is important to bring up the dignity aspect, the more community approach, and just being, respectful and friendly and engaging to people that are around you, like the way you would want to be treated. I'm actually going to start you off with our next question, because I think you look a lot at how people can be treated as clients, but also how they can engage within the system. And this question is, why is it important to include people who are experiencing barriers to food security in the efforts to address those barriers? So giving seats at the table to folks who are experiencing those barriers themselves. Why is that important?
Of course. And I'm always so appreciative of of organizations and people who are looking to provide room and space, and specifically safe spaces for people with lived experience, because, you know, they're, as we've mentioned, we've built a lot of policies and structures on people with less than. And so when you provide these spaces, it's realistically ensuring that we're changing the world in areas that we don't often see to. You're hearing different perspectives that organizations won't necessarily hear, because it's a completely different lifestyle that most employees and funders are looking at. So when you open up these spaces, you're going to hear really uncomfortable experiences and stories that sometimes don't seem realistic, or something that you think would happen specifically within Canada, but it happens so often, and it needs to be heard and spoken to. Because without it, how are we going to change anything? Specifically with when we keep saying we're working towards SDG goals, we need to ensure that those people who are living with less than are able to hear their voices and see that changes are being made.
Exactly. Thank you, Rachelle. Those people do have knowledge to bring to the table, and also it can be uncomfortable, but that's so important to hear those things, because that's what's getting left out of the conversation right now. So thank you. Paul, why don't we go to you next?
Okay, why it's important for us to have folks first have seats at the table. So I'm not going to speak to that because I think it's been spoken to, and I think it's obvious. But I will speak to, you know, an example. The Canada Food Guide was mentioned, and I think that was a really good example, highly flawed. But I'll mention two examples of what happens when you don't have people affected by the issue leading the solution finding. So we have a food guide that encourages people to drink water instead of sugary drinks, which makes sense. Except there are still many communities, as I hope we all know, that lack access to clean drinking water, or that have boil water advisories. You know, those two things can't be separated, I think. The other is also telling people through Canada's most recent food guide that, you know, encouraging people to eat fruits and vegetables. But the cost of fruits and vegetables are increasing, and we're not having a conversation about how to support people with the lowest incomes amidst those rising costs. So, you know, those are ways I think that there's a real disconnect in how we get things that people clap about and say are really wonderful, like the food guide, and applaud it for doing things like saying drink more water, eat fruits and vegetables, but don't connect it to the lived experiences of the vast many of us.
Thank you so much, Paul, for bringing up that point. Ben, I'm going to go on to you next, and then we are going to hop right into the Q&A.
Yeah, the only thing I will add is the discomfort that Rachelle points out, I think is necessary, because we only will grow if we challenge our assumptions. And organization, it's easy for someone with my position and history of privilege to say that we should do these things, but until we actually bring individuals into our organizations that represent the change we want to see and the needs that we want to address, it's just token language. So in order for we need to bring individuals with lived experience in the communities we want to serve into our organizations to truly push the change, because otherwise I can just talk about it for the next 10 years. And that's often what happens. So we need to bring it in, and we need to create the conditions of discomfort, and we need to grow within that discomfort. And we need to challenge ourselves with those perspectives to understand the reality of the people that we're trying to help, that we say we're trying to help. I don't even want to say we're trying to help, that we say we're trying to help, because I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, especially when organizations that may be either settler-led or led by cisgender white men or white folks, if we say we're trying to help diverse and vulnerable and marginalized communities, but until we truly bring their voices into our organizations, we may not be, and we need to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Ben, for acknowledging that, and really making the connection between who are we listening to and what are we actually putting into action and making a plan towards. And I think that's one of the purposes of the Food Security Conference that we're having today, is to, one, highlight a lot of the barriers and who's missing at the table, but also to actually make that connection to a future plan and make sure that people and organizations are being held accountable for making those changes, and how do we go about doing that. So thank you, everyone, Rachelle, Paul, and Ben, for sharing all of your feedback to the questions. That was very helpful. We're going to go into the Q&A. So some questions may have come up in the chat, and you can continue to enter them now. We have Gray, who is monitoring that chat. So Gray, I'm going to invite you to read out one of the first chat questions that you would like to share with our panelists, and I will call on you to respond.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. And so for our dear panelists, the first question that we got was, what are some of the grassroots or underground solutions we can all utilize to reduce barriers to food starting right now? And somebody followed that up by asking if you do mention any specific grassroots organizations, if we could add the links to the chat so people can look them up as well.
Thank you so much, Grace. So looking for grassroots organizations or initiatives that can help with the solutions. Rachelle, do you want to start us off with some grassroots organizations?
Sure thing. That's a great question. Again, a lot of my experience right now that I know of is in Ottawa. What grassroots organizations? Specifically, I think of the Parkdale Food Center and the Ottawa Community Foundation. It's not that. The name is blanking on me right now. But they have a partnership with other organizations, maybe Benita can refresh my memory, that collects fresh food, produce from across Ottawa. And then with all those pounds produce, they split it across food banks, different organizations or shelters, as well as community centers to give to the community. Ottawa Community Food Partnership. Thank you, Shannon. Yes, that's the one. That I think about what solutionaries organizations are doing. There's one called Growing Futures, which deals with hydroponic towers, and they have partnered with various schools and community centers where they teach students how to grow the produce, and then those students then create a business plan and sell the produce to their community, which I always thought was a really great idea. And then you have 13 Social Enterprise, which they incorporated their cultural teachings behind food, and they've created various lines of spices that they sell to the community, as well as large organizations are now buying surplus, so that way they can split those profits within their communities and families.
Thank you so much, Rachelle. There's a lot of great resources. And I think that sounds like a food rescue as well that you're talking about. I've seen that happen where food that may have been thrown out will be rescued. And then there's little produce days at different food banks where they can be distributed or given out to the community. So that's a good point. Thank you. And I know we have some folks joining us from different areas, Ottawa, but also other regions and unceded territories. So feel free to talk about what you're aware of, even if it's not in Ottawa. Ben, do you have a point on that?
I would, well, one, I'm going to give a plug for Paul, Food Share Toronto. We learn a lot just by looking at the stuff they do, and I think they're doing great work, and I think we can all learn a lot from what Paul does. And sorry, I'm not pandering. I actually truly believe that. Our team has engaged with some of his staff over the years around different projects, and we always learn a lot. And I think that Food Share Toronto would be a great place for people to learn more about. And then in our own community, we have an organization called We Grow Food, and it might not be useful to everybody, but they really focus on building community gardens in marginalized neighborhoods. And community gardens are a great grassroots way to start addressing a lot of these issues, because they often just bring neighbors together who may never have talked to each other for various reasons. Maybe their cultural backgrounds are different, maybe their experiences are different, maybe their age gap is different, but you put a garden in the community and people start talking to each other. So find your local community garden organizations, and if you see a community garden, they're great ways to start. They're a small microcosm of some of this work, but they're a great way to start these conversations.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's a really sustainable option and also good for community connections, and we need to see them more around metropolitan areas. And then also, Paul, I guess if you want to speak a bit to Food Share Toronto that was mentioned, because even though it may not be in Ottawa, we do want to look at models that we can adapt or help us.
I appreciate that, and my colleagues and I would be very flattered. But I will say I won't talk about Food Share, but I will say that I think there are two ways of looking at this. So supporting community-based organizations, that's wonderful. I will never, including Food Share and others, I will never stop people from doing that. But I think it's really important not to confuse like building gardens and supporting groups to set up markets, which is work that Food Share does. Not to confuse that with food insecurity, because it's not. It's not tackling food insecurity. Food insecurity is largely an issue of income. So if that's the issue that we want to focus in on, I think there are some specific things that we could be doing. It may not be grassroots, but certainly I will point to one specific thing, and it's that there's a real difference between levels of food insecurity in Quebec and actually the rest of the country. And in fact, Ontario and Quebec used to be very similar. Now there is a variance, and that variance is likely caused because Quebec's social programs, but also because Quebec is indexing their social entitlements, like any type of income support that people receive to inflation. So people are not experiencing the kinds of pressures that people are experiencing across the rest of the country. So there are simple things. If food insecurity is what we're interested in tackling and we want to prioritize the folks that are struggling the most, I think we need to look at policy.
Definitely, Paul. That's a good point. And yes, like sometimes we just think of grassroots as some type of more like food or product based provision, but it's actually the money or the income that allows people to be more independent. Paul, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to say one other thing, and I think it's really important, this piece. This frame of building our organizations and focusing on organizations in place of issues, to me, is part of white supremacy, is part of colonialism. And we need to push back on that. We're not building organizations. We're not trying to take up more market share. We're not trying to increase our profit. We're trying to work on an issue. So I think we need to be really clear about what that issue is and what are the levers available to address that issue, and how do we use organizations to make resources available to those that aren't resourced to do this work, and how do we use organizations to use their resources to push for needed change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. So we're at 12 o'clock. We did start a few minutes late, so I'm going to go to 12:05. Gray, if you want to read us one more question, and I ask that the panelists just give like a 1 or 2 sentence response to this, just to be mindful of time. But any questions that didn't get answered, again, there's going to be breakout rooms after, and you can also direct them to the email that I put in the chat, which was ann.miller@ottawafoodbank.ca. So great. Why don't you read out our last question?
Absolutely. Thank you. So in addition to these incredible organizations mentioned, are there specific examples of ways to reduce barriers to food in our communities? Great. Paul, do you want to start us off for this one?
I've probably spoken to that, so I'll save us some time. I'll probably skip that one, but I appreciate the question.
No worries. Ben, do you want to go next?
I will just give a plug for something that's very dear to me, and that's basic income. I feel that we need to be looking, if you want to look at real policy and income solutions, a basic income in this country is a way to do that in a way that is equitable and is a way more just than existing programs.
Good point. Basic income is something that a lot of people have been advocating for a long time, and it would make a difference. So thank you. Rachelle.
I suppose in addition to those, you could speak to your OCDSB trustees or your local MPs to talk about, poverty, food insecurity, what food programs does to ensure communities with less than can thrive and can, as some people like to put it, just contribute to society, I guess, is what a lot of people like to put it as. So, just advocating and ensuring there's funding in those areas for people to thrive.
For sure. Advocacy is a huge component. And when we know there's power imbalances, advocating with those people who do make the decisions is important. Thank you all. Our panelists were amazing today. Thank you for all of your knowledge that you shared with us. It is very appreciated. And thank you to everyone who put their questions in the chat and took the time to listen today. So what I would ask you to do is, if you have something that you'd like to share as a takeaway from today, or how you'd like to put it into action, you're welcome to write it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and we'll just spend about 5 minutes talking about this, because we're going to come back and do it as a group anyway. So I think we can do that right now. Great. So I see a hand raised from Shannon, if you'd like to go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Benita. Great session. I've definitely learned a lot as well. Something that we've been hearing a little bit in Ottawa is from folks with lived and living experience, wanting to be able to engage them. So through the community development framework here in Ottawa, that folks are feeling quite fatigued. It's often the same people that are asked to do surveys, to engage in focus groups, this sort of thing as well. So I'd be interested to know if people have some strategies, to perhaps to want to be able to engage those folks, but alleviate some of the burden that they might be feeling of constantly being asked to fill out surveys, focus groups, that sort of thing as well. So just some strategies that your organization or that you personally have experienced, to be able to actively participate and have your voice, your valuable voice and opinion heard as well. Thanks, Benita.
For sure. Thank you, Shannon. So looking for some tools besides just all of those lengthy surveys for people to bring forward their concerns and how things can be done in a more efficient way. But if you have any resources to answer Shannon's question, you can put them in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand as well. And again, no worries, Shannon. And again, we're just trying to think of any key takeaways from our speakers, and also how you'd like to implement those takeaways within your organization, and kind of like a plan moving forward. Rachelle, you have your hand up. If you'd like to speak, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure if I could or couldn't.
Yeah, of
Thought I'd
course.
just give some time. This is definitely something that I've experienced, and the youth that I've worked with have experienced. And sometimes I'll hear from some quite frustrated people is that that there are recommendations and there are reports of shared lived experience and lived expertise that people want you to read. And I've heard that often. Another thing that I think about is how, if when it comes to sharing your experience, you're more often than not, I think even like a lot of us, we can say that we kind of box those experiences and kind of forget about them. So when you're asking somebody to come forward, it's you're reliving a lot of trauma. And so one of the things I advocate for now, or a lot of, is to ensure that you have trauma-informed resources available, specifically if you're going out and finding communities that you don't often hear from, whether that mean translators, whether that mean ongoing support, specifically after you've done those engagements or those meetings and surveys, because it's more often later. When I was in a meeting where somebody had mentioned the bus ride home and how that affects somebody, where we're often done our meetings, we can go and we can do something with friends or something. More often than not, those people with lived experience are taking a bus ride home, going home to their empty apartment, or to an overcrowded living situation where they don't have peace, where they cannot vent and kind of decompress and get back to that secure, stable feeling. So I guess if we're looking to find new people, ensure that those resources are available for them. And more often than not, people will say, I'm not just a number and I'm not just a statistic, I'm a person who still has to experience this every day.